Thanks for joining us. We come on the air tonight with that much-awaited verdict in the double murder trial of disgraced attorney Alex Murdaugh. The jury unanimously found him guilty on all charges of killing his wife and son on their massive 1,700-acre estate. You can see over there, there's a mic stand ready to go for a press conference with the legal teams. We're going to bring you that as soon as it begins. But right now, I want to play you the entire moment that Murdaugh was read the verdict. It's worth bearing in mind that Murdaugh is a lawyer. He is no stranger to the courtroom and likely knew what such a fast verdict return might mean. Watch closely as he learned his fate.
Defendant will rise. Madam Clerk, you may publish the verdict.
Docket number 2022 GS 15 00592, the State of South Carolina, County of Colleton, in the Court of General Sessions in the term of 2022, July, the State versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, defendant, indictment for murder, SC Code 16-3-0010, CDR Code 0116. Okay. Guilty verdict, signed by the forelady, 3-2-23.
And it looks like we have some people approaching the stand right now. We're going to listen in.
How are we on the mic check? Thumbs up. Thank you. We got our team out here. Wow. What a great day for the people of South Carolina. I want to thank every one of you for being here tonight. There's a lot of emotion here tonight at this courthouse. A lot of a year and a half, nearly 2 years of blood, sweat, and tears, it feels like. A lot of hard work from so many people. So if you will just bear with me, there's a lot of people I have to thank. But first, those of you who don't know, I'm Alan Wilson. I'm South Carolina's Attorney General, and I got the best staff of any Attorney General in the United States of America. I want to start by thanking our prosecution team. I want to tell you, I've been here for nearly 6 weeks with this team, living in a hotel, and it felt almost like being in a dorm environment in college. Late nights, cramming, studying, little sleep, away from our families, getting up early, getting here to the courthouse, working long hours, getting on each other's nerves at times. But it was all worth it. It was all worth it because we got to bring justice and be a voice for Maggie and Paul Murdaugh and bring justice for the people of South Carolina. I'd like to start real briefly by thanking our team. First, excuse me, I need to put my glasses on. Our chief prosecutor, I tell you, I appointed Creighton Waters to be the chief prosecutor of this case nearly a year and a half ago. And I want to say I'm pretty brilliant because I picked the right guy. And I want to say thank you to Creighton Waters. Creighton, you did a fantastic job. I don't think there's another attorney in the state of South Carolina that could have led this Herculean effort. But Creighton will be the first to tell you he didn't do it alone because he had a team of people. I want to first thank Don Zelinka, who is actually Creighton's boss. He is the Deputy Attorney General, been in the Attorney General's office for over 40 years, sitting here to my immediate left. Don Zelinka, thank you so much. John Metters, many of you got to see him do the closing argument today. John, thank you. You've been a phenomenal add to our team. I'm going to go quickly through the names, but as I read the names, please raise your hand. You know Creighton, you saw Don, and you see John. David Fernandez, John Conrad, Johnny James, Savannah Gowd, Ozzie Toledo, yes. Shane Aceto, yes. Carly Jewell, yes. Carson Burney, yes. Danielle Colon, yes. And our victims advocate, Tricia Allen. Yes. I also want to say thank you to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. Mark Keel assigned some amazing men and women. And when I said it was an agency-wide effort on behalf of SLED, I can't underscore that part enough. Every time I called Chief Keel, every time I reached out to the lead agents, every time Creighton was asking me, hey, General, we need something from SLED, we would reach out to SLED, and they were there. They busted their butts. I can't begin to list every agent, and some can't be listed for obvious reasons. Some are standing up here tonight. I told them I wasn't going to mention their names, but we would not be here if it wasn't for SLED. And I want to thank Mark Keel and his team and all of the men and women across the entire state law enforcement division for what they did to make tonight a possibility. Amen. I also want to thank the FBI and the Secret Service, our federal partners. We had to utilize many of their assets and resources. We couldn't do all the things that we did without our federal partners. We had a lot of local partners. We had the Colleton County Sheriff's Department, Buddy Hill, Sheriff Hill and his team, providing the security. They did a phenomenal job, and they were there. They were the first responders the night on June 7, 2021, when Maggie and Paul were butchered brutally. They were the first responders, and they were the first ones to be there. The Charleston County Sheriff's Office, the Orangeburg County Sheriff's Office were instrumental in supporting our investigative efforts. You all know Kenny Kinsey, our chief crime scene expert, was with the Orangeburg Sheriff's Office. I also want to thank the city of Walterboro. I think the mayor is here somewhere, and the police department. They provided security. Thank you. This whole community has embraced our entire team, and I cannot thank you enough. We've all been away from our families, 2 hours away from our families for the past 2 months. And it's this community that made us, we would walk into restaurants and people would come up and thank us. You know, you don't have any idea how good that makes people feel when they're under an incredible amount of stress, an incredible amount of scrutiny, and this community really embraced us. I want to thank the Colleton County Clerk of Court, Becky Hill, and her entire team and their staff. I don't know. I call her Becky Booth. That's her nickname. But Madam Clerk, wherever you are tonight. I'm sorry. That's my pet name for her. But I want to thank you, Madam Clerk, for you, the entire team, the bailiffs, the court security, the staff here. There was no role that was too small that they weren't willing to do for us. The security team here, it was a Herculean effort by everybody, and I can't thank enough people. I don't know if I mentioned the bailiffs, but I want to thank them. And there's another group of people who you don't know who they are, but that's the jurors. And not just the jurors, but the alternates, the ones who didn't even get to serve to the very end, but people who were taken away from their families. And I want to thank the families of our jurors who sat here every single day for what seemed like long amounts of tedious, monotonous information and evidence. Sometimes people didn't know what it meant. They didn't understand it. And they had to sit there and process it and hear it over and over and over again. And I want to thank these nameless jurors whose identities have been protected. They may make their identities available to all of you at some point, but they sat there and they delivered justice tonight, and I want to thank them for their role in this process. Amen. You know, Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government except for every other kind. I kind of want to adopt that and say we may have the worst criminal justice system in the world, but it's better than every other kind that there is. And our criminal justice system worked tonight. It gave a voice to Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, who were brutally mowed down and murdered on the night of June 7th, 2021 by someone that they loved and someone that they trusted. And they couldn't be here to testify for themselves tonight. Their testimony came through the evidence and the information that was gathered by the men and women of the agencies I just mentioned. It came from the testimony of the agents and the investigators and the attorneys and the folks in our staff who were able to get it to the court record. And so I want to say tonight, their voice was heard tonight and justice was brought for them. We can't bring them back, but we can bring them justice. Amen. Amen. I started off my remarks by saying that it is a good day in South Carolina. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Today's verdict proves that no one, no matter who you are in society, is above the law. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. A lot of people doubted that this process would work, and hopefully, for those who did doubt the process, hopefully we have instilled and put a little bit of faith back into you and your lives as you view this process as it unfolds. I'm proud of this team. I'm proud of the men and women standing behind me tonight, and there's been a lot of emotion, and I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I saw firsthand for the last 5 or 6 weeks the countless nights where you were up beyond midnight and you were getting up before dawn, not eating. I was watching Nancy Grace the other night and I heard her call Creighton pale and gaunt because Creighton wasn't eating and sleeping. He really wasn't, folks. I'm serious. So, you know, we would have to bring in Kind bars and things to eat during breaks. But Creighton, Herculean effort, my friend. And I am truly honored to have you on our team. Thank you for being a great leader and a great chief prosecutor. And I would like to invite you to come up here and make some remarks for the folks here tonight.
Thanks, everybody. And I want to start by thanking this guy who's given me and all these folks behind us opportunities to do justice, which is what we want to do with our careers. It is very tough and demanding, but it's rewarding for moments like these. The general stole a lot of my lines, but I also want to thank the jurors for their long and arduous service. And we had no doubt that if we had a chance to present our case in a court of law, that they would see through the one last con that Alex Murdaugh was trying to pull. And they did, and we're so grateful for that. I get to lead the state grand jury section in the Attorney General's office. This particular case is not a state grand jury case. There are other indictments that are state grand jury. But the one thing about that is that I have an amazing team. And I want to be clear, this was a team effort. Y'all saw all of these folks behind me doing amazing work. And I can't be prouder of a team in my life. We called this our Super Bowl, and not because of the media attention, but just because of the effort that we knew that we would have to put into this. And we didn't really get to watch much of the Super Bowl that went on because when we arrived, I think it was winter and it feels like spring now. But every single member of this team, every single member of the state grand jury staff, what we do well is work together as a team in complex investigations, and who we work with is my partners at SLED. And I can't thank them enough as well because we're used to working on these complex cases and working together. And I'm not leaving out Sheriff Hill and the Colleton County Sheriff's Office and our federal partners in Orangeburg and Charleston Sheriff's Office and all the other agencies that have worked on this case. I also want to thank Ms. Becky, if she's still up there, because she's been amazing. The clerk staff has been amazing. The court staff has been amazing. The bailiffs have been amazing. And again, I also want to thank this community who really has embraced us and has been so great to us and made us able to survive this process that has been long and arduous. And I have been sleeping. I hadn't been. And I have been eating more than Kind bars every now and then. But, and I'm sure that's a nice plug for Kind. But anyway, it really has been a great process. We will have sentencing tomorrow. Obviously, we're not going to comment on sentencing because that's still pending. But justice was done today. It doesn't matter who your family is. It doesn't matter how much money you have or people think you have. It doesn't matter what you think, how prominent you are. If you do wrong, if you break the law, if you murder, then justice will be done in South Carolina. And I think South Carolina has shown to the nation and the world how a process can work and work well. Thank y'all.
Yeah. And also, I want to thank Creighton. I told Creighton, I said, Creighton, I'm going to come down and I'm going to be just a staff attorney. I know I'm your boss. I'm your boss's boss's boss. But I said I'm going to come down and I'm going to help. And I said I'm going to follow instruction. And I hope I was true to my word. This past weekend, I was saying, what can I do to help? I said I'm willing to take a witness if it'll help. He said, actually, it would. So he let an old prosecutor dust off his cleats and get back in the game and to help the team out. And
I got to be the boss of the boss for a while.
Yeah,
so
don't get used to it.
I'm not used to it.
No, but in all seriousness, I'm proud of the decisions that I made in putting the people behind me and to the left and right of me in charge of this case, and I was honored to be part of this team. Just another member, just another worker bee in the trenches trying to bring justice to the people of this state and to bring justice to the people who couldn't be here tonight because they were brutally murdered by someone they trusted. Now, with that being said, I know a lot of people want to talk to us. A lot of people want to talk to some of the attorneys and the support staff and the agents, investigators here tonight. Some of you want to talk to me and others. We're going to make ourselves available to you. But like Mr. Waters just said, tomorrow there's a sentencing hearing, and we don't want to get out in front of our skis. And plus, I'm starting to feel the rain come down. But I promise you, we're going to make ourselves available to talk to members of the media, to talk to all of you out there that have questions. We'll answer any questions that we ethically can. We hope you'll continue to be patient with us as we finish this process tomorrow. Again, we're going to go back and get a good night sleep tonight. But again, thank you. I'm going to also, one last group that we didn't thank, the media. You all, I know a lot of people in this, polarizing world we live in, a lot of people take shots at the media, but the media was incredibly respectful. You were so good, not just to us, but listen, to the families of the victims, okay? I know this is an awkward situation, but, you protected the identities of people and, you protected the process. And I want to thank you for your part in this and telling the stories, educating the public on what's going on out there. So now I'm going to stop speaking as an attorney general, and I'm going to close as a father and as a husband to say that when you go home tonight, hug your loved ones, hug your spouse, hug your children, because this case reminds us of anything that you can't take for granted that people in your family are always going to be there. And right now, when I get home tomorrow, I'm going to hug mine, and I hope you hug yours. But thank you again. Thank you for your prayers.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your prayers. You came and prayed for me. I see a lot of people come up and say we're praying for you. We appreciate your prayers. Thank you all so much. And this is going to conclude this press conference. We look forward to talking to all of you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna let you go right here. I just want to thank you and your staff.
And that was Alan Wilson, the Attorney General of South Carolina. We're going to go back in front of the courthouse there. We've got NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber. She joins us now from just a few feet away from where that was happening. Ellison, you've been covering this trial for some time now. You were preparing for a very long night tonight. Were you surprised that we saw a verdict returned in just over 3 hours?
Yes and no. At different points throughout this trial, remember, it was 6 weeks. It was there was this sense that you thought one side was maybe leading and then it would ebb back to the other side. We were having this discussion. A lot of people who had come to the court to watch were talking about what we thought might happen. And at one point after the closing arguments, I thought maybe 2 hours and they will probably come back with a guilty verdict because the closing prosecutor remarks were so compelling. But then I talked to people who know the law here in South Carolina really well, and they reminded me that in South Carolina, it's a little unique in that the charge of murder, there aren't degrees here. In other states, there's first degree, second degree murder, and they had said they thought because the state spent so much time focusing on the motive, when in their view, it really wasn't necessary because there weren't varying degrees of murder in this state, that maybe they had gotten a little off of the path and that maybe a jury would just be a little confused and not necessarily believe the very complex motive that the state presented. But ultimately, this jury did. And one thing to keep in mind, Gotti, is there were so many layers to this. And throughout all of it, the jury was not able to take notes. They were having to just listen and do a lot of this from memory. But there was a very rare, very crucial moment towards the end where the jury was able to go and visit and see the scene where this murder actually took place. They were able to spend time at all of the locations that they'd heard so much about, near the feed room where Paul Murdaugh's body was found, next to the kennels, the area around the corner there from the kennels where Maggie Murdaugh's body was found, and also walk the distance to see the outside of the main house. That, you have to think, played a big role in some of this, because you can look at documents, you can look at diagrams from investigators of where things took place, but you probably don't really understand or grasp the distance and all of the factors until you see it in person. And this jury actually had that opportunity. Gotti?
Such an ominous trip to the murder scene. Thanks so much, Ellison. We'll be checking back with you in just a bit. With me now is a legal analyst and attorney, Angela Sinandella. Also with us is NBC News legal analyst, Danny Savalos. Angela, that was a very fast verdict. What do you make of how quickly the jury reached this verdict?
Gotti, I was surprised. As I watched the closing arguments with Danny, I thought that both the defense and the prosecution had very compelling arguments. I thought the question of financial motive was really hammered by the defense, and I was not convinced so fast that definitively a financial distressful situation would result in a murder of a family. That said, that means they all agreed, so I'm happy the criminal justice system worked. It means that all the jurors came to a fast decision together. It wasn't like one person was just berating the rest and dragging it out. So, to that end, I'm happy.
So you were watching it with Danny there. Were you guys in agreement, or Danny, did you think it might go another way?
You never know. No lawyer, no regular member of society, none of us have any idea until the jury verdict is read, especially if you're counsel, whether you're the prosecution or the defense. Until that moment, you second guess yourself. And especially when the jury's out, you start going over everything you said. Did you do enough? Should you have called this witness? Should I have objected to this point? And so this is the kind of second guessing you do to the point of agony when you're waiting for a jury to come back. So if anyone, including me, says, I told you so, or I knew this was going to happen, we are lying, because you never, ever know what a jury is going to do. You may have read some tea leaves into the 2 or 3 hour deliberation process, but even that could go either way. They could have gone into the jury room and said, do we all agree that this was a shoddy investigation? Well, if so, then there's reasonable doubt. That burden of proof, that standard, is a defendant's greatest ally, maybe even more so than his attorneys, is the fact that he is cloaked in the presumption of innocence. And sometimes that alone can carry the day. So the bottom line is no one ever knows for sure until the words are read from the sheet.
Angela, as the prosecution was resting their case, what stood out the most to you?
To me, the prosecution's whole idea that this motive was, drawn from this man's financial distressful situation was, I think, what carried through to the end. That was the gathering storm that we heard a lot about. But then in rebuttal, I thought that the prosecution brought it back. They said, well, look, jury, whether or not you believe a motive, he could still be guilty based on all of these things. So I think the defense was strong in the interim. The prosecution brought it back to say all of this circumstantial evidence in totality, even if we don't have any direct evidence, sealed the deal. This man is guilty.
Danny, do you think that there was a motive established in this case after it's all said and done?
Who cares? And I'm speaking for the prosecution because that was the tack they took in their rebuttal. Someone got hip to the idea that this whole motive theory just doesn't fit. And then someone else on the team probably said, well, then get rid of it. We don't need it. Motive is not an element of the crime of murder. So they never needed a motive, but prosecutors, I understand this, they have to prove their case, so they want to give the jury some theory, something to hang their hat on. The problem for the state in this case is they gave them a theory that most people just couldn't believe. People have a hard time believing that even someone beset by the greatest, most dire financial problems, facing criminal prosecution for fraud, would respond by killing his wife and son. It's hard to believe. And by introducing that, the state clouded what was otherwise a strong circumstantial evidence case. Not only a strong circumstantial evidence case, but one through facts, data, through OnStar, through Snapchat, that put the lie to what the defendant had told law enforcement. And that led to the defendant essentially having to take the stand. But his explanation as to why his story didn't jive with the data, his response was, well, because I lied. For many jurors, I suspect that was the end right there.
And that's something that we heard again and again from prosecutors. Let's take a moment and just listen to some of that closing argument as it played out today.
Motive demeans the opportunity and ample evidence of guilty conduct and guilty conscience. All four factors are present. Everyone who thought they were close to him, everyone who thought they knew he was who he was, he's fooled them all. Don't let him fool you too.
Don't let him fool you, too. And then you go back to the trial, the lack of defensive wounds on some of the victims. When you're looking at some of the evidence as it was built up, the Snapchat video, the ballistics report, do you think that there was a particular moment when some of the jury may have started to say, you know what, doesn't matter where this is going, I've already made up my decision?
Gotti, I think it's a question of, did the prosecution win this case, or did the defendant lose it by going on the stand? And I'm going to go with, when Alex Murdaugh got up on that stand, he just said, I lied about the Snapchat video, I lied about my alibi, but guys, I'm not lying to you. That did not carry through. So whether or not the prosecution even had a strong case, the fact that the defendant went up there, lied to everybody, and admitted, I think sealed the deal.
Danny, would you have put him up on the stand?
I would have thought about it, but the reality is you do that sometimes. Well, you do it rarely, and when you do it, you do it for one of two reasons. Either you're desperate and you have nothing else you can do, or you have some piece of information that you absolutely have to get from your client that can't come out any other way. And there really wasn't that. Alex Murdaugh had already denied shooting his wife and son. He'd done it on video during interviews, so you didn't really need that. Maybe they wanted to put him on to explain away why his story didn't match the story the data told, the OnStar, the Snapchat, everything else. And as I said before, his explanation was, oh, well, they don't match because I'm a liar. So like Angela just said, that may have been the death knell for the defense when he took the stand. But it does go back to the general rule that you don't put your client on the stand unless you absolutely have to, and especially not if they have credibility issues. This is a case in point. In fact, it could be said this defendant had so many credibility issues, it was almost less impactful than if he only had one or two lies that he'd been caught with. This defendant had so many lies, you got the feeling the prosecution had an embarrassment of riches. They had a challenge in organizing all the evidence between the lies and the data and the technology, marshaling it together and making it coherent for the jury. I think they were challenged by that in their closing. You saw they had to use the old prosecutor PowerPoint with the words in 8-point font because they just had so much information they had to impart.
And when the defense is looking at all this on paper, it's one thing. But then when you have an attorney, a very high-powered attorney that is very familiar with the courtroom, you can see how maybe they would have thought that this could have gone the other way. Do you think that this was an issue of possibly hubris, putting him on the stand?
If you're asking me, no. The answer, I think, is I think we got a little hint as to why Alex Murdaugh took the stand. And when his attorney announced it, he said, Mr. Murdaugh wishes to take the stand. That may or may not be a signal that during attorney-client conferences, Mr. Murdaugh, as he has done apparently so much in his life, thinks that if he can just talk to people, he can convince them of anything. And this is not an uncommon position for criminal defendants, particularly white-collar criminal defendants. They often think that if they just get a chance to explain everything, then everything will be cleared up. This is all just a big misunderstanding. And that may be what Murdaugh told his lawyers, and since he has a constitutional right to take the stand and tell his version, he may have exercised that, and he may have exercised that against the advice of his own attorneys.
Angela, do you agree?
Yes, and Danny, as you're a defense lawyer, you must also know that lawyers often make the worst clients because lawyers always think they can get up on that stand, they can convince everybody, they can talk their way out of everything because they are familiar with that courtroom. They know how to convince a jury. So I think here that is what sunk him. He had a lot of pride, he had a lot of arrogance, he thought he could explain it all away. Clearly he didn't.
This is also a weird case because you got two weapons charges. You got weapons charges and a weapons charge conviction, and yet you don't have a weapon. Does that matter here? And because we got those weapon charge guilty verdicts, what does that say about what the jury ultimately decided?
For me, if you're asking me, the jury can draw inferences, and it may surprise you to learn that under American law, you don't even need a body for a murder case. You can have a bodiless murder case. So it stands to reason that you don't need a firearm to conclude that somebody carried a firearm. After all, we've all seen plenty of movies. Criminals drive on a bridge over a river and they toss the gun into the river. So you can charge someone and convict them with possession of an instrument of crime, a firearm, and you can charge someone with murder even if they disappear the body. In fact, I happen to know that personally. I've had one of the few murder cases every year in the United States. There are only a handful that are no-body murder cases, and you can get a conviction without a body. You can get a conviction without a firearm.
Now, one of the things that I did see at the last possible minute was the introduction of this, this possibility that there might have been two shooters there. Does this mean that there were definitely not two shooters, or does this mean that the jury just thinks that Murdaugh was involved?
This means that the jury thinks that it was just Murdaugh because they did not give any credence to that theory. If they did, that would have been reasonable doubt, and that would have resulted in an acquittal. But here we see that they were guilty on all charges, which to me is pretty clear.
And the person that I keep thinking about is Buster Murdaugh over and over again. This is a boy that does not have his mother or his brother anymore. The only parent he has left, his father, is now convicted of murdering his family. I want to play a little bit of his testimony earlier in the trial before today and before the verdict was read. Take a listen.
What kind of condition was he in? What was his demeanor?
Yeah, his demeanor was, he was destroyed. He was heartbroken. I walked in the door and saw him and gave him a hug and just broken down.
I'd love to bring in Ellison Barber if we can. She's been at the courthouse for quite some time, and Ellison has probably been able to see Buster up close and personal. But Ellison, I want to ask, how has he been doing throughout this trial, and have you gotten any sense of how he is right now after this verdict has come down?
I mean, not a ton of emotions. I remember being here for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and there's an area just across the street from the courthouse where there are food trucks where people are able to go get lunch, members of the media as well as people who were in the courtroom. And there was one day where I was walking back from the media center that's next to that food truck, and just in the crosswalk past Buster, John Marvin, who is Alex Murdaugh's brother, who took the stand, his other brother, Randy Murdaugh, who didn't take the stand, and then his sister, Lynn Murdaugh. And you see Buster from very far away because he has very bright hair. He has been in court every day. He often walks in with his girlfriend, and he does not show a lot of emotion one way or the other. He didn't show a lot of emotion when he was on the stand. As those guilty verdicts were read, at one point when the camera cut to his face, it looked like he was wiping his eyes and nose. He seemed to be getting a little bit emotional, but that was really the only time I can think of where we've seen emotion from him. He's often very stoic, listening, sometimes bending over, from what our producers in the courtroom throughout this have said, and at times biting his nails. But this was sort of the biggest emotional reaction I think we've seen from him so far, and it wasn't a huge one. I mean, this has been a long process, too, to get to this point. Like, you go back and think about the night that the murders occurred. That was June 7th, 2021. Then you had all of this stuff happen in between, from his father being shot in the head on the side of the road. Initially, he said that someone had just driven by while he was changing his tire and shot him in the head. He gave a very detailed description of a suspect. It turned out that it was actually one of his drug dealers, who's known as Cousin Eddie. And then he said that he had actually paid him to shoot him in a botched suicide attempt because he was hoping that a surviving son could get his remaining life insurance. That happened. His father went to rehab. He was indicted on a bunch of financial charges. Then he was indicted for murder. Then this trial began 6 weeks ago. So at some point, you have to think, I don't even know if I would be able to have any emotion at this point, because he's been through so much throughout this. And there have been so many questions, so many allegations surrounding this family and their history and death deaths that happen in proximity to them, from the housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, on, that there's just a lot here, that there has to be a lot going on in his head. But in terms of showing it outwardly, we really don't see a lot of it from him or John Marvin or Randy Murdaugh or the sister Lynn. John Marvin was emotional when he took the stand. But other than that, they've been relatively tight-lipped since Alex Murdaugh was indicted for these crimes. They briefly did some interviews earlier, prior to that, but this is a family that has kept things pretty close to the vest and hasn't spoken a whole lot publicly or shown a lot of emotion, other than they have been here in the court every day since this trial began. Gotti?
Ellison, this guilty verdict has kind of shifted a little bit of the lens as we look back, and you just brought something else up, the suspicious death of one of the housekeepers there a few years back. Now that we have a guilty verdict here, just refresh our memory. What happened at that time? How was that ruled not a homicide, and where does that death stand in relation to what we've seen today?
So there were actually two different deaths where the Murdaugh names were mentioned prior to this. One, a young man named Stephen Smith, whose death was ruled a hit and run. He was found dead on the side of the road. This was years ago. And throughout different investigations, a name that came up there was Buster Murdaugh. And since all of this has happened, investigators said they have reopened that case to take a look at it, because Stephen Smith's mother has always said that she did not believe he was killed in a hit and run accident, that something more nefarious might have happened there. So that investigation has been reopened, but there haven't been any updates in the months since. There was just an acknowledgement that they were reinvestigating some aspects of what was deemed at the time a hit and run. Then there's the death of the Murdaugh housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield. She'd been with the family for a very long time. There was a 911 call that was made by Maggie Murdaugh, and then also Paul Murdaugh. He got on the phone as well. They said that she had slipped and fallen outside of the house and had hit her head. She fell into a coma and died later. That came up a bit in this case because Alex Murdaugh stole $4 million that was supposed to go to her surviving children after he advised the children to get a lawyer who happened to be one of his friends and sue him so they could collect insurance money. Now there have been questions raised about the circumstances surrounding her death. At one point, if I'm remembering everything correctly, I believe there was talk about exhuming her body to redo some of the autopsy and kind of start some aspects of looking at some of these questions that now have surrounded this family, because there have been so many what some describe as suspicious deaths in their orbit. And there are still questions of where things go with those different cases, those different incidents from here. But there have been no charges for Buster Murdaugh or any changes with Stephen Smith's death at this point. Just an acknowledgement from law enforcement that they were reassessing, looking at some stuff again. And then on Gloria Satterfield, there has been just a lot of questions about how that actually happened that night. And then Alex Murdaugh has admitted now that he did steal that money from the children. But that trial, the actual trial for all of these financial crimes, Alex Murdaugh faces 99 financial crimes related to stealing from legal clients, law firm, embezzlement, all sorts of things. He has not actually gone on trial for that yet. So all of that is still a factor. That's something that presumably he will be in court for at some point. But there's just so much surrounding this family that didn't even make it into court. And I think that's why you have had so many people hyper-focused on this case, because it's sort of hard to believe that in a small community, this one family that's very well known would have all of these weird incidents take place around them. And a lot of people in the community and outside of it have raised questions saying, hey, should some of this be looked at again? And I think that is an open question of how deep some of those past incidents might be looked into moving forward. Gotti?
And Ellison, you were just mentioning that $4 million that he admitted to stealing from his housekeeper's family. That was just a drop in the bucket when it comes to the millions of dollars that he stole from other people, too. I think it's somewhere around $8 or $9 million, 99 counts of financial fraud. And yet it seems as though it goes in so many different directions. In one case, it has to do with the family of a deceased housekeeper on his property. In other cases, it seems to be with clients and with partners. Are these all basically being compiled into a super fraud case, or are these all going to be tried separately?
I believe they'll all be done at the same time, but I'm not 100% sure because so much attention has been focused on this murder case, and the charges here were so serious. The sentences would be so lengthy that once these charges came, felt like just such a distant sidebar. But that's something that he will have to account for. And we heard throughout this murder trial how many people close to him felt betrayed, how many are angry, how many still want their money back, and how many still have questions about why he did all of this. Alex Murdaugh says that he was stealing this money because he was addicted to opioids, and this was how he was fueling his addiction. The prosecution in this case tried to raise questions about that, tried to sort of dismiss that by saying, no, actually, if you look at how much money you've stolen and for how long, it certainly ramped up during the more recent years, but you've been doing this for a really, really long time. And they pointed to all of that to say, you know, people can come on the stand and tell you that Alex Murdaugh was a loving father, that he and his wife were lovey-dovey, that the family, no one ever saw them fight. But they say, look at what he did with the money all these years. Everything that he did, Alex Murdaugh loved himself more than anyone else. And he has stolen so much money from people who he knew really needed the money and people who he knew were in very difficult places. I mean, he even stole from a friend of his. He stole from a lot of his friends, and they had no idea about any of it. So this is someone who lied consistently, has admitted that he has stolen a lot of money, and he claims that it was in relation to his use of opioids. But the prosecution said that's a lot of pills. They didn't seem to really believe that even if he had, and they do say, had an opioid addiction, yes, but they say you couldn't take that many pills and survive. They felt like he was trying to use that to make himself seem sympathetic when they said, really, this has always been about money for him. And they described his life as a Ponzi scheme and said anytime he was on this hamster wheel of stealing money, trying to keep up with all these different things, protect his name, and then whenever the wheels started turning, he shifted things around, stole wherever he needed to keep living and doing the things that he wanted to do. And everything, they say, started because he was greedy and he wanted money. Gotti.
And he lied, and then he admitted about that, all those lies in open court. We're going to touch on that when we come back in just a bit. Thanks for joining us. In case you missed it earlier, South Carolina legal magnate Alex Murdaugh has been found guilty on all charges tonight. It was reached after the jury deliberated for about 3 hours. Murdaugh was found guilty on 2 counts of murder of his wife, Maggie Murdaugh, and his son, Paul Murdaugh. He was also found guilty on 2 more charges of possession of a weapon in these murders. It was the murder case that a lot of the country has been obsessed with, going back to when Paul and Maggie Murdaugh were found murdered in their family estate back in June 2021. Then for nearly 6 weeks, the Alex Murdaugh trial dominated headlines. 2 things may have turned the trial for jurors. 1, when Alex Murdaugh took the stand in his own defense, and 2, just yesterday, when the jury got to make a field trip of sorts to the Murdaugh family estate to see the crime scene in person. Again, Alex Murdaugh has been found guilty on all charges. Sentencing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. He faces 30 years to life for each murder conviction and up to 5 years for the weapons charges. Back with us is legal analyst and attorney Angela Cinandela, and also with us is NBC News analyst Danny Savalas. We were just talking with Ellison Barber a little while ago about the financial crimes and the amount of fraud that has been committed here and the amount of fraud that has been admitted to on the stand in separate cases that we're going to be seeing in the future. So I wanted to ask, Angela, just starting with you, how much of this trial and his testimony will we see introduced in future financial fraud cases?
Well, I think we're going to see a lot of his actual testimony, which is also why the risk of him going on the stand was significant, not just for this trial, but also for the impact. Remember, he made these statements under oath on the stand, so that can undoubtedly be admitted as evidence in the next trial.
And Danny, do you think that when you're looking at cases in the tens of millions possibly for fraud, $8 to $10 million, and you're trying to separate it out from family members, from partners, from the people that he stole from, how difficult is it to make sure that everybody gets restitution in a case like that, or is it even possible?
Well, proving the case first requires a lot of more technical evidence than you saw in this case. Financial crimes cases can be really complex, especially because there's going to be a lot of bank records, a lot of witnesses authenticating bank records, a lot of going through bank records. So it can be very granular. And then the second part of your question was restitution. And unfortunately, in a lot of white-collar type cases like this, restitution is but a hope and a dream, because folks like Alex Murdaugh, if he is guilty of these crimes, these frauds, they have a tendency to take that money. They don't put it into a 401k. They don't stick it in a savings account. They use it to feed their habit, to pay some gambling debt off, to do whatever. But most of the time, when defendants steal large sums of money from people, that money is in the wind.
And you think of that 1,700-acre property that they have, a lot of their other pieces of property, and the fact that Buster Murdaugh is still his son, and he was going to be left money if Alex Murdaugh successfully killed himself with the help of somebody else, which didn't happen. Will Buster Murdaugh be protected from some of the attempts at restitution here?
If you're asking me, Murdaugh, it's going to be complicated because you also have the son and the lawsuits against family and the deceased Paul, and Paul's estate now has to essentially defend against the suit if it has any money to pay a judgment. So this becomes a very complicated analysis. And believe me, there will be many different fish trying to feed at this estate, at the estates of not only the deceased, but assets of the defendant who is now incarcerated. It's going to be a very thorny picture. And that's even before you get to the estates. I'm still talking about proving these financial crimes and trying to line up creditors and see who, if anyone, gets paid.
If you're a prosecutor on one of those cases, of the fraud cases, and you see him on the stand testifying and admitting over and over again to basically the case that you've got coming up, actually, I think we have some of that sound. Let's go ahead and cue that up and take a look at what may be something that we see in court in the future here. Take a listen.
Everything about me not going to the kennel was a lie.
And you're able to just do that just so easily and so convincingly and so naturally, don't you?
I mean, that's not for me to judge.
That's true.
Seeing him lie like that on the stand over and over and over again, what does that tell a prosecutor about the way that they should approach a financial crime case?
I also have a question with the jury pool. How is the potential jury pool not going to have watched all of this and come out with some sort of opinion on this man who has been on the stand and lied and admitted to lying? So to me, that's a question.
You're talking about a possible change of venue to somewhere very far away from South Carolina.
Or, I mean, frankly, anywhere in this country who has not been following this trial. Yes, so finding a jury pool that hasn't listened to all of this in South Carolina and come up already with some sort of biased opinion on his guilt is going to be difficult.
Danny, I want to ask you, what do you think is going to happen tomorrow at sentencing?
This is a really unusual procedure. The jurisdictions I practice in, including federal and several states, they usually separate the sentencing some time out after the conviction. And that's because usually probation has to do an investigation. They have to put together a picture of who this defendant is for sentencing. They have to figure out his prior record score. I don't think Alex Murdaugh has any prior record, but this is something, these are among the things that normally need to be calculated. This state apparently has an unusual procedure in which they sentence almost immediately. And I could understand that if it was an automatic sentence. For example, some jurisdictions have an automatic life sentence for murder. They may not have the death penalty, but you get automatic life for murder. That's not the case here. This is, I believe, a minimum of 30 years to life. So the judge actually has some discretion here. And that's what makes this so unusual. When there is discretion in the judge, normally procedure requires that there's some investigation done and the sides get to prepare and submit sentencing memoranda and make arguments. I can't imagine either side is going to have substantial time to prepare tonight, memoranda, arguments for sentencing, unless they lined it all up in advance, expecting a verdict going one way or the other.
I also wanted to ask for, when it comes to the windows for a mistrial, we saw the defense asking for a possible mistrial right after that verdict was read, and the judge seemed to deny that. But the window to ask for a mistrial on something that may have come up, and I keep thinking of the juror that was dismissed at the last minute, what is that window? And do you think that that's something that we could see, or at least motions for a mistrial in the next coming days?
You won't see a motion for a mistrial. At this point, the motions for mistrial are made during the trial, but by doing so, you take a bookmark and you stick it in the trial, and that preserves the issue for appeal later on. The general rule on appeal is at the trial court, you use it or you lose it. If you didn't object, you probably waived it. So that's an incentive to object early, object often, make your motions, preserve them for the record, because without preservation in the trial court record, the appellate court has nothing to look at. They really can't consider new things generally for the first time on appeal. So you won't see a motion for mistrial. You will absolutely see an appeal. It's an automatic that a criminal defendant convicted of most crimes appeals, certainly murder. So there will be appeals. There will probably be appeals all the way up to the Supreme Court of South Carolina, because this is at least an interesting case, if not a legally significant case. It certainly got a lot of media attention. So there will be appeals. This case will go up. So far, not so sure what there is to appeal from. You could argue it's that financial crimes evidence, but I've said for a while, that financial motive, kill my wife and son to get sympathy, I think that actually helped the state ultimately, but it also helped the defense because it gave them one major thing to seize on and argue that this doesn't make sense. And that almost got them an acquittal, I think.
Angela, I want to ask you a final quick question here. Do you think Alex Murdaugh will see the light of day? Do you think he'll ever be a free man again?
No, I don't think so. I think 30 plus 30, et cetera. We're not going to see what's going to happen in sentencing, but there are high minimums here. We're going to see victim statements tomorrow. I expect that we'll see victim statements from people who've been affected by his financial crimes. I don't think he's going to walk out unless he does some sort... Sorry, I don't think we're going to see him again unless we see him do some sort of interview from behind bars.
Or he takes the stand again in the financial trials, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you so very much for joining us. And that does it for us here at NBC News Now. Again, oh, sorry, we're going to go to a break. A quick recap on the breaking news tonight out of South Carolina. Alex Murdaugh found guilty on all charges in the double murder of his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul. We saw guards removing Murdaugh from the courthouse earlier tonight, taking him into custody. He will be sentenced tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. You can watch that live coverage right here on NBC News Now. But before we go, at the center of this Alex Murdaugh trial is the loss of two people, a mother and a son, Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. South Carolina AG Alan Wilson said this win finally brought them justice. We'll leave you tonight with his final thoughts.
Their voice was heard tonight, and justice was brought for them. We can't bring them back, but we can bring them justice. When you go home tonight, hug your loved ones, hug your spouse, hug your children, because this case reminds us of anything that you can't take for granted that people in your family are always going to be there.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.